hello.
Hello?
How are you doing, sir?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Do you want to do cam or no?
Either way.
Okay, yeah. If you have cam, it'd be better. Awesome, awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Um, for those that don't know, this is Ben Burgess. I'm trying to get your titles correct. You're in Georgia, correct? Currently, correct?
Yeah, I'm a adjunct philosophy professor at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and I also write for Jacobin, and I have a show called Give Them an Argument, so I think that's all the standard stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm pretty sure that everyone here knows you, but just for those who do not have that whole introduction sort of set up, just pulling up my notes here. All right. Well, I want to first just kind of introduce you to me a little bit because I know I'm a
Mhm.
smaller creator. So I'm out of Flint, Michigan. We've I think you used to follow me on Twitter and then stopped after some stuff happened. But I followed pretty closely Michael Brooks and the Majority Report crew for a long time from the beginning of Michael's career and otherwise. So I was introduced to you through the Michael Brooks show and your appearances on there. Oh, yeah, let me change this because this is bothering me. There we go. That makes me feel better. Um, and so I'm out of Flesh, Michigan. I'm a socialist. I'm not like a well-read socialist, but generally I'm just very bad at reading. I have ADHD, so I have difficulties with that. Um, so there's a lot that we generally agree on, and I'm definitely one of the ones who defended a lot of the things that weren't. I didn't write you off like some people had before, but I did want to have you on to talk about your views on cancel culture, some things that we may disagree on regarding that. But I did want to start from a place of like the things that I agree with you on, the things that I like that you've done. Your debates with Destiny, I thought were really well done. I love that you put a stance in there that I hadn't quite heard that socialism needs to be global. And the more I thought about it, it is absolutely true, especially considering capitalist countries wanting to take out any left-leaning governments as soon as they can to gain their economic interests. Um, and I do agree with you that there's a problem on the left with them kind of treating certain stories with kind of disingenuousness, like it's a monster of the week sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, I call that out a lot. I mean, I'm from Flint, Michigan, and anytime I see somebody on the left say the classic phrase, "Flint does not have clean water,"
Mhm.
I am always just like, do you even know? When's the last time you
Right.
checked in on us? Things like that. And I also know you're from Michigan, which is cool too. I see
Mhm.
you got a Red Wings shirt on. So go Wings. Let's see here. I liked your debate with Charlie Kirk. I liked how aggressive you were regarding that. One thing that like a lot of people really disagreed with me, and I agreed with you on, was your take regarding Jordan Peterson years ago. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
when he checked himself in the hospital for his drug addiction. Um,
Mhm.
a lot of people wanted to wish ill of him. Now, I'm definitely one of those people who will agree that certain people are better passing on for society. Henry Kissinger, Koch
Mhm.
brothers, things like people who have like the levers of power. But Jordan Peterson, I don't really see as someone who's like that. He's a propagandist, sure, and I won't feel bad when he passes
Sure.
on. But my whole argument was you can kind of just feel nothing and recognize that addiction is bad um, when
Yeah,
someone like that is
I
dealing
mean,
with
if I
that.
could just like parenthetically jump in on that one,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit of a funny example because I've probably devoted more time to bashing that guy than like just about any other single figure since I started doing what I'm now doing a few years ago,
As
and
you should.
I certainly haven't stopped since then. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I don't, and I also think like sometimes some of the subtleties this get lost on Twitter, but like I don't think that my position was never that like I thought anybody was like a bad person for not having the emotional reaction that I did, right? You know that
Mhm.
they like I don't care about that, right? You know, my the whole thing was just when I read that Peterson checked himself into rehab. Gonna be a little bit careful about this just because this is not mine to tell, but like I had there's somebody who I cared about who had like literally like within an hour before I heard that I had gotten a call uh, from somebody else who told me that this person had just had a like heroin, or I guess probably really fentanyl overdose, and they'd survived that one. Actually, they did subsequently die of another one, like a couple years later, but like that they'd survived that one. And I was pretty shaken by that, and that was like on my mind like an hour later when I saw this story. And I was reading the details of the story that his wife had cancer, and and he'd like gone down the benzos after that. And yeah, I mean, my sort of visceral reaction was like, Jesus, that's depressing. And I sort of tweeted like, I obviously disagree with this guy about everything, but I really do wish him well in rehab. Hope he gets the help he needs. So and it was a startling thing. I mean, I don't think it was really that many people, but it was striking to me because of who some of them were. Right, that some people like, well, if I'm expressing sort of sympathy for Jordan Peterson as a person, that's like some sort of endorsement of like,
His
you know,
transphobia and all that. Yeah.
all of that, and that never
Yeah.
really made sense to me.
Yeah, that's sort of how I felt too. Like that because I've known drug addicts, and I've known people who died from either drug overdoses or being shot by their drug dealer. So uh yeah, it definitely is one of those things where you have to. I always see the left as being uh compassionate, and I understand where people do harm, and there's no endorsement of his transphobia in any way, and I understand more than anything why trans people would wish ill upon him, because there is a lot of damage there. It was just very hard for me to just like focus in on his drug addiction and see that as a reason to beat him, because then I just feel like I'm punching down at drug addicts. You know what I mean? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I've been trying to be more conscious of this because the headset that I'm using, if I take a sip of coffee, like the slurping just like broadcast to the universe. Uh, but um, but yeah, no, for sure. And again, I mean, I think like who you um I don't know. I mean, I guess I think empathy is a good thing, but I also think that like how you like what particular feelings you're having about any particular public figure, like as a person, are just not that politically salient, right? I mean, like let's say I don't know. I mean, if Henry Kissinger has I don't know, like let's say he dies of cancer, and because it's fucking Henry Kissinger, like I'll probably still like gloat about it, but like if somebody was like, hey, there have been 6 people in my family have died of this kind of cancer, all I feel about this is disturbed, then like I don't know that that would particularly bother me. I mean, like I think I could get that. I mean, probably it wouldn't really stop me from, it wouldn't really stop me from probably writing um, like writing a really nasty obituary of him and Jacobin, which is what I would do, if that happened. But like, but I would also get it.
Yeah, yeah, seriously. Especially since the mainstream media will do nothing but gloating reviews of his death and be like, "Oh, he was a statesman. He was a wonderful human being who was a philanthropist." After the dude led to he put plans together that led to the deaths of millions. Like, fuck him. Absolutely. But I totally get what you're saying there. So, because we only have an hour, I did want to kind of move along, and we can move on to some of the more critiques to kind of build up over time. So let's start from here. The question that I've always wanted to ask you. You have a lot of focus on like comedians and cancel culture. And I always just feel like these are just like small issues that don't really affect anything. They're like tiny sort of culture war-esque issues that people get distracted by paying attention to. Like, I'm on the side of yes, call them out, but continued focus on them is very weird to me, and especially the debate over them being canceled for God, how do I put this together? Well, let me just put it this way. Do you really think that comedians don't have any effect beyond the jokes that they tell? Like, are they not part of shaping, or at least the barometer of public discourse on topics?
Barometer maybe a little bit, but I actually don't think that comedians shape much of anything. And although the part of what you just said that I agree with, I think, is that focus would make sense. And I don't think I have focused. I think that I think I have the title of the book before last, which has comedians in it. But if you read the book, so there's a chapter about comedy, and that's the one where the title comes from. But the whole point of using it as the title is that I think it's a stupid example to focus on. Like in other words, like I think it's that the whole point is I was trying to come up with the most trivial thing that people could get mad about, for the contrast of the title. Right? This is because I actually think, I like comedy as an art form, but I don't think it's politically important. I actually don't think it shapes much of anything. I think that if you look, for example, in the 2000s, in like the new atheism era, there was a while where like every single comedian would, like sort of sounded like Richard Dawkins when they're talking about religion. That like David Cross would have long, atheist things in his comedy albums, Patton Oswalt, whoever. And I don't actually know that in retrospect that made, that produced a lot of extra atheists, or did much to undermine religion, right? I mean, I think that it's I'm actually so that's one thing, right? Like I'm actually pretty skeptical of how much influence comedians can have. And then another thing is that I think that if we are going to talk about it again, I mean, the reason it's used as the example, the title is because I just thought it was like a self-evidently silly thing to worry about, right? That the so as a sort of example of the way that a culture of counterproductive moralism, can influence the left. It just seemed like a usefully extreme example to me. But the other thing also, if we are going to talk about its merits, like in itself, right, and like just talk about the actual merits of some of the accusations, I actually do also think that quite often, quite often, even to whatever extremely limited extent, you actually do think that comedians have influence on much of anything. The I feel like the effect of this kind of moralism on, I don't know, comedy criticism, I guess, is to make people is to sort of make people kind of dumb about it. Like I think that oftentimes it's like weird and tone deaf and sort of treats like taking everything that's said and like every sentence that somebody says in the context of a comedy set as if it were an editorial in the New York Times. I mean, I've seen a lot of that. We could go into examples if you want, but I also, but again, I mean, like I one point I would just really want to stress about this is that I think that the point could not be further from thinking. that, like this is actually spelled out, I think, in exactly these words in the book, right? That comedians getting yelled at is the most important thing ever, right? The point is almost the opposite of that, right? That sort of this kind of symbolic pseudo politics where dissect dissect what's going on in a Marvel movie, or you get angry about something a comedian says, and try to get whatever, try to get some streaming service to dub them or whatever, is just an unhelpful distraction from real politics.
Well, here's what I'm gonna have to disagree with you, because I
Mm-hmm.
do believe that comedians do have a an effect on the topics of the day. Someone like Jon Stewart had a very big impact on telling people during the Bush years that, hey, it's okay to continually come out against Bush at a time where people were being kicked off the air. We can discuss his effectiveness and him being more of a liberal, but someone like him led me to learning more and more about more and more left politics. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
I reject him now and recognize the futile attempts that he made at doing anything at all. How he's essentially just a political nihilist, just a rich dude. I'll
Mm-hmm.
completely agree with that. But Chappelle was very beneficial in me learning a lot more about race going forward when I was younger. Um, I'm 37, so I was an adult when Chappelle's show came out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, he was instrumental in what we, when I was in a touring band, we would watch nothing but his comedy specials and old episodes of the Chappelle Show.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it helped me understand some things, like the building blocks to understanding racial issues.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a number of comedians that do speak to that and do push the sort of social awareness. And we may not ever be able to measure the effect that they have, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't believe that they have no effect, and I don't believe that it should be minimized. I think we get a little bit lost on this sort of extremes between no effect and massive effect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that the concentrations on uh, going after people like Dave Chappelle or what's another one? Um, Dave Chappelle is just the big one, so we'll stick there.
Sure, let's
Um,
stick with Chappelle. Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Oh, okay, so I think what I said was I don't think they have that much of an effect. I mean, if the issue is whether it's literally none, then sure, right?
mhm.
It's hard to say, it's hard to argue literally none. I mean,
I
I
don't
do
think
kind
the
of think
pushback was that extreme either. Starting out, I think it that's where I'm talking about, where it gets pushed to these sort of extremes. Like you saw an extreme pushback. I think it was like a couple of days, and the big thing was it kept going because of the people who wanted to endlessly defend Dave Chappelle, and it
I
was
actually don't
putting
think that's
people.
true.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I think that I mean, I think if you look at the way mainstream media just endlessly hyped opposition to it, right? I mean, like there was a walkout at Netflix that was like literally got like a week of build up at all of the biggest media organizations in the country and had like 20 people, and it wasn't even clear that most of them worked at Netflix. Like I think that's a sign that it was getting a lot of the thing itself was getting a lot of attention. And I also think so there are two ways in which we could ask the extreme question, right? So one of them is like how much attention is being paid,
Mhm.
and it does seem to me that like an utterly bizarre amount of attention was being paid. And then the other
At the
is,
same time, though, media is not also a very good barometer of how much people are paying attention either. Like, sure, it could be just as much ratings of, it could be more ratings of the people defending him than the people who are going after him, because most of those people, if they're on the left, they're not watching mainstream media anyways.
well, I'm not sure about the last claim, but uh, but I do think that there was a lot of attention that was paid on both ends, right? That
Hmm.
like I think I think way too much attention paid on both in both cases. I think entirely too much, right? Towards attacking and towards defending. because again, my ultimate positions is just not very important, and it doesn't really merit it. Um, and certainly I saw a lot of emotional intensity devoted to attacking. And also, I will say, I mean, enough people who are attacking were watching mainstream media that I would be very surprised if even 1% of people attacking had actually watched the special, because by and large, what I saw were people who were responding to sort of individual sentences in ways that if you had watched the special, you would know that those individual sentences weren't being that the implication was misleading, right? Like, this is another thing, right? That I think that um, so we can have the discussion about how much impact. I do think that I do think less than people typically think, right? I don't think none. I do think less than people typically think, and then we can have a discussion about, okay, forget for a second how much impact. Just is what's actually said reasonable or not? Is it extreme in that way? And
I mean,
I will
it's
say,
hard to misinterpret. I'm Team Turf, you know.
oh, actually, I totally disagree. I think it's extremely easy to misinterpret. It was in fact widely misinterpreted. I think that if you watch it in context, there is a 0% chance that that was meant seriously. Um, and this is what I'm saying about how nobody actually, nobody who got upset about it seems to have actually watched the special. They read quotes from it or watched very small clips from it. I
Because
think in
I
context,
didn't watch it, but I stopped watching
so
because
this
of
is
his
what I'm
last.
saying.
Well, let me get into that. I didn't watch it because of his last comedy special, which not only did
Sticks
I
and
think it
stones.
wasn't very funny, but he had some transphobic things to say within there too. Not to mention, he also decided it was a good idea to drag my city, which is cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was a whole thing.
So
Um,
okay, so I did watch it, which by the way I probably wouldn't have, but
but
but I'd
doesn't he
had
make like an attack helicopter sort of joke?
no,
Wasn't there something with uh, the gorilla or something like that? I identify as.
nope. If there was, I somehow managed to miss it, but I did watch it. I certainly don't remember anything like that in there. I do remember the Team Turf line, and I could, since again, I probably wouldn't have watched it all else being equal, but in the course of the 2 weeks of people obsessing about it on either side, and like numerous people asking me what I thought, and because I mentioned Chappelle in the book, it was like, but what about this and that, so new special. So it's like, all right, fine, I'll watch the new special. And I was actually shocked by the disconnect between what was actually in that special and the way it was being portrayed. Right. So, when he says I'm on Team Turf, that comes about 30 seconds after saying I have no idea what the fucking turf is. And it comes about 2 minutes before saying I'm not saying trans women are women, which it's like, okay, if we're taking every sentence of this, like it's every sentence spoken in a comedy special is literally what he thinks, then which is it, right? Because if you are a turf, you do in fact think that trans women aren't women. That's the whole point.
Mhm.
And I think that what's actually going on, if you watch if you watch the whole thing, is I think that he is going through his history on the issue. He's describing some comedy set that he gave a million years ago, 2005 or something, where he says, he sort of ruefully says, my pronoun game was not what it is now, and he's describing people getting mad about it. He's describing him being defensive about it. He's describing working through, sort of mixed feelings about it. That's where this sort of on the one hand, on the other hand of the, if this is what it means, blah blah blah. I'm on Team Turf, but actually, I think trans women, like that's where all that stuff happens. And the overall arc of that whole part of the special is all about his coming to a place of greater empathy about it. It's he goes into. I know there are a lot of disputed details in here that I'm not going to try to weigh in on, because I just I've seen the special, right? That's my level of background here, but he has, but he he's going in, this is not some like ass covered flourish. This is like the whole point of that part of the special. It's like half an hour spent talking about this. He talks about a friend of his who's a trans woman comedian, and he talks about his relationship with her, and the whole arc of it is about talking about how this is giving him a greater level of understanding of what she's going through, and how people who are just sort of like yelling at him about it, that didn't have much impact, but like what she's sort of saying to him, hits home. And then in fact, one of the last things he says in the special about the topic, right, which is again, you could argue, well, okay, clearly he didn't stick to this, right, given some of his comments later or whatnot, right, but it is kind of remarkable given the disconnect between this and how it was portrayed and all of the a lot of the media about it that was just kind of seeking out controversy clicks and trying to portray it in the most inflammatory way possible. One of the last things he says about the special is, I'm not going to tell any more jokes about this subject until I'm sure that we're all laughing together. Right? I mean, this is something. I just don't. I have a really hard time seeing how anybody is going to watch. If you watch the special and you're a trans person and you just don't like some of the tone, you don't like, just the general fact that, you've watched a bunch of Dave Chappelle, you have a good idea of what the style is, very sensitive issues in a very Chappelle-ish way, and you, the whole thing leaves a bad taste in your mouth, it's not for you, I could understand that, right? But I don't think that anybody's going to watch this and it's going to make them more transphobic. I think that I have a really hard time imagining anybody who is somewhat inclined in that direction not coming out of this
Well, I
and
mean, I don't
having the opposite reaction.
I don't think these things come down to having like a pushing people to be more of anything, except for more grounded in their preconceived notions that they already have.
Okay, but like we could frame it in that way, right?
If I could really quick, like I found the entire quote from the "I'm Team Turf" line. So I'm Team Turf. You have to look at it from a woman's perspective. Look at it this way. Caitlyn Jenner, who I've met, wonderful person. Caitlyn Jenner was voted Woman of the Year. Her first year as a woman, ain't that something? Beat every bitch in Detroit. She's better than all of you. Never even had a period. Ain't that something? I'd be mad as shit if I was a woman. I'd be mad if I was me. I can't say this last part because it includes the N word, but yeah, like
yeah, the last part that you're not quoted
the
is where he
Eminem
says
part.
some,
They don't have anything else in there. It ends
yeah,
after the Eminem thing.
well, okay, I mean, but it doesn't, right? I mean, which is the point,
No.
right?
I'm just saying on what I found.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, you've just quoted 30 seconds of it, which is like in the course of a prolonged sort of like on the one hand, on the other hand thing. Again, it's comedy, it's not an editorial, and the overall drift of this whole like half hour of the special is, that's kind of the starting point, the sort of overall drift of it. I mean, the kind of moment where it culminates is when he's quoting Daphne, I think is her name, right? The thing about how she wants people to acknowledge that she's going through a real human experience, and it's the whole movement of it, right, of it is in that direction of greater empathy. And so this is what I'm saying. Like, I think if we're asking, is this going to make people more grounded in their preconceptions or less grounded in their preconceptions who start out with transphobic preconceptions, I actually think the special as a whole is probably going to make them less.
I don't know. Everything I've seen, and even from trans people who have watched the whole thing, I've seen it just be. I like. You want to talk about outrage clicks? I think the way that he went about things was to pursue outrage clicks for himself. I think there was a completely disingenuousness to this, to the way this special was perceived. I feel like he might as well called it canceled or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
It
know
was
what you
that
mean. I
aspect.
know what you mean, but I will say I have seen reactions from trans people who have said the opposite of that, right? Trans people are obviously not a hive mind.
Hmm.
You're going to get people, who have very different reactions. I've already kind of said I can, I can see where somebody could watch the entire special and have a bad reaction for the reasons I kind of said a minute ago. But I also get why there are trans people who watch the special and had a good reaction. I mean, like if you want to say, I mean, I tend to think that Chappelle, probably like a lot of comedians and a lot of artists in general, will pursue certain obsessions, and like probably more than is good for them. I mean, when I kind of saw that he's going to be continuing to talk about the stuff in the special, my initial reaction is like, oh my god, just move on, right? But I think that if you're going to look at what was actually said in the special, all I could say is I just really disagree. I think that most people who have a bad who think that it was who think that the point he was making in that bit was a transphobic point, I think are basing that um, on short quotes
Hmm.
rather than actually watching it and getting the kind of overall point and the overall feel of what he's saying in that whole section of the special.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not the person to have that conversation about what went on because yes, I didn't watch it, and I didn't watch it just for those reasons. For one thing,
Mm-hmm.
probably the biggest thing is I didn't find his previous two specials funny at all. Like,
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a
let
that's a
me
good
ask you
reason
this
not to watch.
question,
There you go.
and this will be the last question on the Chappelle thing,
Sure.
so that we can move on from it.
No.
Because I think honestly, the better person for you to talk to about that would be somebody more studied in it and who watched the special. Someone like Andrea would
Hmm.
probably be someone better to talk to. I know, but
I
she
mean,
does really want to
I mean,
talk.
I mean, I mean, I mean just since you brought her up, let me just say real quick, right? My history with Andrea is she, like, over the summer, she denounced me in the most over the top, ugly way that you could, right? That they have, like, I think I watched like the first 2 minutes of the video, and there's lots of dumb as a shit fuck, cringe to her, etc., etc. I was like, okay, that's like very unpleasant, and so I ended up saying no to the invitation to talk. And then months later, we like she did apologize for saying those things, and since I'm
I
somebody
mean,
who
that's a
almost
kind
always
of online content creation, to be honest with you. Like
okay, well,
I try to avoid that,
it's
but
not my kind of online content creation.
yeah.
It's not the style of online content creation that any online content creator that I have respect for uses.
Hmm.
I mean, I'll just say that, right?
Hmm.
I don't say stuff like that. None of the people I watch say stuff like that. I'm not saying there aren't lots of people who do, but I
Yeah.
don't, and I wouldn't. And like even people who I genuinely hate,
Hmm.
like people who I genuinely deeply despise, I still wouldn't talk about them that way.
Hmm.
So all I could say is that that's just a very different sensibility. When somebody says, "Oh, I don't even dislike you," I just said all those things, right? Like it's like, well, okay, we're living in two different universes here. But she eventually, like months later, she and her fans kept pushing, you should have a discussion, you could have a discussion of, and I kind of said, well, I don't, all this left a bad taste in my mouth and I don't really feel like it. Eventually she apologized for it. We had a discussion, which I thought was a good discussion. Again, I almost always take almost every invitation to talk to somebody.
Which I appreciate.
Um, we had what I thought was a good discussion. And then after the Rogan appearance, I mean, I am not going to watch it based on my previous experience watching her other video, the previous video about me that I've watched, but just based on the title of it, it seemed like it was even worse than the one before. And
I watched it on stream, and of course, there's
I mean, the
there's the
title said
anger.
promoted transphobic conspiracy theories, and if you believe that, I'm sorry, you're an idiot. Like, if you believe that I would ever in a million years promote a transphobic conspiracy theory, then first of all, I don't believe that you believe that. I don't believe that anybody believes that, because I believe that anybody who's ever read, watched, or heard 30 seconds of me in any context would know better than that.
I mean, I think there's a difference there because I think there's a lot of times when people don't recognize that they might have like a slight spot, a blind spot um, for certain topics, and
Okay, but
they sort of speak out of
there's a
line.
galaxy of difference between you have a slight blind spot for this topic and you're promoting transphobic conspiracy theories.
Yes, 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 of course. But I mean, again, we're talking about online content creation, and I watched that video,
Okay,
and I thought there was
but
a
again,
lot.
like that's a kind of online content creation I just don't want anything to do with. Like
Mhm.
anytime somebody says, "Oh, online content creation just means you're going to say things like this," it's like, well, again, it's not my kind of online content creation. It's not the kind of online content creation of anybody who I have anything to do with, anybody who watch, anybody who I normally interact with, right? Like I mean, if those are the rules of that world, that doesn't sound like a world I want to have anything to do with.
It's marketing. It's one of those things that it really does suck. But when I watched it, I thought there were a lot of really good critiques of it. There were a lot of fact checks that were really well made. Receipts brought. So she would definitely be the one that I would have that conversation with
Okay,
over someone
I
like
mean
me, because my
that is
concentration wants to
it
be
is right
more.
now unlikely because like I spent 6 months not having a conversation with her because I thought that what the things that she said were so ugly and over the top and unfair. And then like
But you did wind up having a conversation. You do agree
no,
it was a good
I
conversation.
did wind up having a conversation because because she apologized for that. And then like it just seems like now I mean it could be that she made the most brilliant and insightful points ever in the midst of it, right? But if it's
Hmm.
going to be the same thing, but even more so, right? I mean, like I, I just, I just don't see, like, I mean,
I don't know.
if it's going to be that again, right? Like,
I mean, it wasn't last time, and she had critiques. So who knows? I don't know. That's just my view. It's just that she would be
when I say
the.
that again, I don't mean the conversation. I just mean
Yeah.
that that's if this is just going to be the pattern, that whenever I say something she doesn't like, right, she's going to put out a video that's like, Ben Burgess is a despicable piece of shit, then like that's not somebody I particularly want to talk to, even if there's a Jekyll and Hyde transformation when the actual conversation happens.
Hmm. Hmm. I guess so. Like I said, someone like that would be a better person to talk to. Maybe isn't specifically Andrea, but someone like that would be a good person to talk to about that topic specifically. Because like I got a lot about your Rogan interview specifically. Um, I guess the last question on sort of the cancel culture thing before we move specifically to Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that there's a difference between like fair criticism and canceling someone
Of
on
course.
online, and what would that be? What would be your
Yeah.
preferred way of doing it?
Yeah. I think that criticism and sort of pylons where people are kind of performatively being vicious, I think there's a pretty straightforward I think there's a fairly straightforward distinction between between those two things. I think anytime like certainly I think like actual criticism, I think tends to involve like trying to engage with the substance of what somebody is saying, and like try to say things that might actually even be trying to persuade them, right? That they like that like are or at the very least, are things that you would say to persuade not necessarily the person, but somebody who didn't see what was wrong with what the person said.
Yeah, I,
Whereas,
I normally see like those sorts of things get boosted as being the majority opinion, but whenever I look into or am myself a part of the people criticizing someone, most of the critiques that I see that do get turned into that sort of thing where like people are getting canceled and bombarded and blah blah, it are legitimate critiques in good faith, and they're not just saying, oh, you just want people to die and fuck you, blah blah blah, you know. So I think it's more of the sort of loudest voice in the room gets the squeaky wheel gets the cheese sort of thing, where it's like, you all look at the thing that's the loudest, as opposed, and most um uh, egregious, versus the ones that were more of more of a constant, which was legitimate critiques and asking legitimate questions and saying, hey, what's up with this, and why are you saying these things when this and this and this.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to adjudicate that on a case by case basis. I
Mm-hmm.
will say that that certainly if you read like John Ronson's books, You've Been Publicly Shamed. I think that's a good one for this. Or Mark Fisher's Exit the Vampire Castle, for example, or a book.
I've heard a lot
I
about
think
that.
that I think you could point to a lot of cases where there are at the very least a troubling number of squeaky wheels, and I think there are a lot of bad incentives for wheels to be squeakier, and I think some of that is just a bad feature of our particular late capitalist hellscape where people are incredibly atomized. Some people feel most connected to others online. Or
Well,
the platforms themselves are set up in ways that like really incentivize sort of mindless
that's
instant denunciation.
that's one thing I was
And
going to bring up is like how the platform is set up, and of course the way Twitter is designed now is a lot of those comments get kind of filtered out. Um, you know, they have the thing that pops up at the bottom of the screen. This is could be offensive, blah blah blah. This could be more abusive language, or the more reply sort of thing. And usually, like I go down the rabbit hole sometimes where I'm just like, I'll click on those. And usually what I see is the most vitriolic content right there from accounts that have like one or two followers and no picture.
yeah, I mean sometimes that's the case. Although again, I don't think it's always the case. I think it'd be useful if we had a way to quantify it.
It would
Um,
be,
you
would
know,
be, yeah, I agree.
you know,
Better
I think
studying of it would, better information on that would be insanely
but
helpful.
but yeah, I mean, I do think that the whole structure of likes and retweets and the way that the algorithm works does reward sort of being the person to cast the first stone and like sort
Mhm.
of denounce something right away, so you can get 100,000 attaboys instead of like actually waiting a minute and making sure that you understand what somebody's actually saying. I do see that as a real problem.
Mhm. I mean, the part that I agree with is definitely there's a lot of people who jump the gun on certain criticisms, and I'm usually the one who usually tries to tell people to wait till more information comes out because we get sucked into the kind of now news cycle where we're pushing for like a sort of a scoop sort of deal using journalistic terms,
Hmm.
especially with like online creation. Like this is why I talk about like it's ever since I started doing online creation, which I've been doing this for going on 4 years. Like it's really strange how the vitriolic stuff does catch on the best, but you have to do it in a certain way. Um,
Hmm.
it's not merely saying the most vitriolic thing gets the most attention
Hmm.
because usually it doesn't. Usually it gets
Hmm.
no attention. Um, so I
Yeah,
don't
you have
know.
to pull it off right. Sure.
Hmm. So just to move off of that for time. So getting to the Joe Rogan interview. So I thought a portion of it. I didn't get to see all of it because I don't have the access to getting to it. I watched Lance's video of him watching it,
Hmm.
and I guess there was like another 2 hours left. But it got into a lot of the topics that I wanted to focus on, honestly.
Hmm.
So let's start here. What sort of plan did you have going into talking to Rogan? Because it kind of seemed like you were more interested in talking about your book in cancel culture.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that seems frankly nuts to me because, um, especially given that I was invited on to talk about the book, I can't imagine somebody watching it and not be obvious that like that was about the bottom of my priority list. That we didn't even mention the book really
No,
until
not really
like half.
just the book, but like the topic
No,
of
I
it.
mean
The
cancel culture in general, right? I mean that they have
mm-hmm,
But the first hour was largely spent on economics. The At the beginning, like I didn't even bring a copy of my book. I held up Adolph Reed's book about the South
Mhm.
at the beginning of the interview. My plan was to take every possible opportunity to pivot to sort of core, real world like bread and butter issues, and to do so in a way that seemed friendly and approachable to have a normie friendly pitch to socialism for Rogan's giant audience. And I feel like that's exactly what happened. I mean, that they have a that the more hot button cultural stuff was largely the later part of the interview. The first, I mean, within the first hour, there was extensive discussion about Medicare for all, about teachers unions,
Mhm.
and why they're valuable, about why the post office is valuable, about Bernie Sanders' proposal
And I thought a
for.
lot of that was that was fine, you know. It
I
didn't
mean,
really.
given what you've said about how much you watched, like what the topics I'm describing are the vast majority of what you watched.
No, I know. It really started to go downhill for me about probably an hour to an hour and a half in. Um, but yeah,
I mean,
I
if
mean,
so,
I'm
that's beautiful because I can't imagine more than 1% of people watch more than an hour. So that's
yeah.
if that's when it started to go downhill, that's a win. I mean, I
I
think
hope so. But people watch the whole Rogan shows. They
there's
dedicate
there's a
their time to it.
hardcore of people who do, but I would be very surprised if look. I think most shows of any kind, right? Like I think the beginning is the part that's more watched
Hmm.
than the end, unless people are like unless it's like a live show and people are tuning in the middle. But yeah, look, I think that given how long it took for us to start talking about any of that stuff, right? I mean, like, and given that that was the topic I was invited on to talk about, I think it's pretty clear that that wasn't the priority.
Hmm.
And I'd also point out that, and even later on, right? I mean, like every time there felt like a good opening to talk about unions, talk about Medicare for all, any of that stuff, right? I always took it, and I was always looking for it, throughout the entire interview. But I would point out, even on social issues, right? That I know some people didn't like the fact that I was very frank about about lack of expertise on sort of medical details of both like sort of debates about exactly what the clinical requirements should be for youth transition and about exactly what a reasonable place is to set hormone requirements for women's sports participation.
Yeah, you did
Although
kind of
looking,
back off on that, which
I did not back off on it. That's 100% false. What I said, right,
hmm
is I front loaded at the beginning of what I said. I front loaded my lack of medical expertise to indicate that I'm not interested in talking about the details of that. I have no interest in arguing into
hmm
that. But like at the on the actual core positions, right? Should trans women be entirely excluded from women's sports? Like no hormone requirements, just can't participate. And should youth transitions be allowed? On the youth transition one, I seem to get him to agree at the end, right? Like the last thing that was said on that was my say that it's not like getting a tattoo, because being forced to go through what you experience as the wrong puberty would be traumatic, and Rogan at least doing that. Oh yeah, no, that's true, right? That was the last thing said on that. On the women's sports thing, after we'd gone back and forth extensively, the last thing that was said about it was me asking him, okay, if you don't like the rules as they are now, what do you think they should be? And him saying, I don't know, and then us moving on because once I said my piece, he said he doesn't know what he thinks it should be, and we
hmm
moved on from there. I'd also point out that that elsewhere in the conversation, I got him to agree a couple times that it was important that anti-discrimination laws include gender identity, as a general thing. And I also seem to get him to agree pretty enthusiastically that anti-CRT laws were an assault on free speech. So honestly, I mean, I know that what some people would have liked me to do would have been to do a ton of research and like spend a lot of time going back and forth on the finer grained details of hormone requirements and all of that.
hmm
But I actually think that would have been a terrible strategy. I don't know what anybody thinks that would have done, because for one thing, these are issues he's far more focused on, than I am, right? So like trying to like just
Well,
bone up on all that a lot, right? Like I think I think probably wouldn't go well. And two, I think the sort of message that look, I'm not focused on this enough to to get into a conversation about the nitty gritty, which is good because I want to move off of it.
But
But also,
you know that it's a big topic with him, and you know that it's a big story at this time coming out that's being pushed by the right. The story about Leah Thomas and the one picture.
given that, what's the best strategy for dealing with that? Given that is the best strategy to attempt to go toe to toe on those details, or is the best strategy to just front load? Look, like the vast majority of people listening to this, right? I, on the sort of like on those details, I don't know, which is why, by the way, I said several times on both of those topics
Mhm.
that I think these are best left to medical experts.
Yeah,
Right?
and I
That they
mean,
have anything.
I'm someone who definitely when it comes to issues like that, I do my best to a not speak for the marginalized community, and b I try to be very careful in how much information I give out and how much based on things that I know for sure versus
Mhm.
information that I just think I heard somewhere, and I think that's correct or whatever, where you can kind of get into trouble and say the wrong thing, and then it turns into a whole thing where like are you trans medical? All the weird intricacies that can go with trans issues. I think it would have been really good considering Joe Rogan's history to go a little bit harder against him on that. His past statements regarding trans women's sports has been egregious over the past years, and I don't know how much you moved him on that, but if you were looking for like a clip that could have gone like viral, the type of clips that go viral now regarding Rogan are the ones that accurately push back against him, uh, and these sorts of things. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that is 100% not what I was looking for there. I think that
Well, I mean, why
that
not?
why not? Because I think that that would be a terrible use of the platform. I think that the thing like just having essentially what you're talking about, right? It would be pandering to getting slow claps from from people who already have their antipathy towards them or whatever. And I just think they're bigger fish to fry. I think that I think that the point again is to try to have that normie friendly pitch for socialism to his giant audience. And I think that and I think that the actual like the way to handle issues like that is to sort of get the basic point of principle out there, right? About here's the sort of like I think it would be and you're right. I don't think I moved him on the sports thing. He did seem to be moved. I mean, time will tell, of course, right? I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
like one conversation by itself doesn't mean that much, right? But like
Mm-hmm.
in context, he did seem to be moved on the youth transition. He didn't seem to be moved on the sports. That one was more of a sort of like, well, he clearly nobody watching that could think he moved me 1 millimeter. I mean, like I started out by saying, right, I don't know and sort of unstated, right? Don't care enough to know, right? The sort of finer grained medical details about exactly what the right hormone requirements should be because I don't stay up at night worried about the athletic integrity of Ivy League swim meets.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it would be cruel to say people just can't participate. If I had a trans daughter and she wanted to, I would certainly want her to be able to, want the rules to be set up in a way that would be able to, which I think that kind of like sort of direct human, like, this is why I see this in this light way, right? Like as a sort of brief way of dealing with it, but also not getting stuck on the topic for an hour, as could have like very, very easily happened, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if I had gone in there in that spirit, I think is a much better approach, and I think it's an approach that's like if anything is going to, I mean, the way I tried to approach that stuff in that conversation is very much the way that I would encourage everybody to do when they have like a conversation with with like a their cousin, their coworker, their brother-in-law, who might be pretty open to left appeals on certain kinds of economic issues, but who also might consume some right-wing media, might have some cultural attitudes we're not crazy about, and what the way I would encourage, but is like at least willing to hear everything out, right? The
Mm-hmm.
on all those other issues, And the way I would encourage people to talk to that guy would not be to come into it really confrontationally and denounce them at all, right? Like I think that would be a horrible strategy. I think that the way that I would encourage people to talk to that guy in their lives would be very much the way that I was talking to Rogan, which is to say like put a lot of emphasis on the things that you think they're probably most persuadable on, and even on the hotter button issues. Clearly state your disagreement, right? But don't denounce them, don't call them names. Just sort of say, like listen carefully to what they're saying, right? When you do see a sort of opening to say, well, that part doesn't really make sense to me because blah blah. Sure, say that, right? But like mostly approach it in the spirit of that's not how I see it, right? The way I see it is like this in a way that, keeps the lines of communication open. And I guess I would just say the last thing I'd say before throwing back would just be like, you brought up the Charlie Kirk debate earlier, and to me, I mean,
That's what I was going to bring up again. Like, why not
this is
have
a
that
very
strategy?
different this is a very different context, right? So I think that with somebody like Kirk, I think the goal of the the goal of the event is to try to get the audience to see that he is try to get whoever is persuadable in the audience to see that he's full of shit, right? To see that like when he claims to be a populist, he's really no such thing, right? And even at that, right, I still don't approach it
But
the way.
isn't that same critique true of Joe Rogan? I mean, he said he would support someone like Bernie Sanders, of course, but he's also anti-vax. He also comes out as a COVID denier several times. His we already talked about his critiques of trans women in sports. He's a figure that's just like that, and his viewers see his show as Joe having an intelligent conversation and a free thinking conversation with people. Um, it's it does kind of have that air of, especially considering how much stuff he would likely disagree with you on, especially around COVID. That's a hot button issue for me. I'm a big medical person going to school for it. Blah 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 blah. But there's a lot of things that you could go into it with that same idea, and sure, it might cause some vitriol among Rogan's base, but it could also bring a good portion of them over to your side to hear you out, because you are one of many giving this proper pushback against somebody who is wrong on the facts.
Yeah. So two things. One specifically on COVID, and then the other on the sort of more general issue of the comparison between the
Did
context of the.
COVID come up? I'm just kind of curious. Sorry.
Not really.
Okay.
It did. He. Um,
I heard
I
one
can't,
reference to Pfizer, and I was like, "Oh my god."
yeah. It came up a little bit around the edges, but but it wasn't. But not not extensively.
Mhm.
So yeah, so yeah. First, specifically on COVID, and then on the Rogan Kirk comparison, right? Because I think that second one is the really important point, for like why I think I see this differently than you do. So I think on on COVID specifically, like this seems like like I think that I mean, actually, there is exactly one argument that I could have had with Rogan on COVID that would have been useful, which would have been I wouldn't have pulled it off with nearly this much panache, right? But would have been essentially the one that he had like a year or two ago with Bill Burr, right?
Mhm.
Where Burr knows him well and can kind of yank his chain well, right? So is says like, Jesus, Joe, are we really going to do this, right? Like pretend
Mhm.
that
I
that
know
either of
what you're
us
talking about.
know anything about this. I don't sitting here smoking a cigar or whatever. Like you without a medical degree, me without a medical degree, right? All I do is I watch the news every once a month to see do I still need to wear a mask or no mask, right? Like
Mhm.
I think Burr's approach to that was probably perfect from like a layman perspective. But otherwise, right? Like I think he just had the names of the doctors blur together in my head. If I try to say it, I'll probably accidentally say one of the like bad COVID denying ones instead of the good
Mhm.
one that he had just talked to. But But he had in fact very recently before mine, right, done an entire 3 hour episode with a medical expert, to whatever, try to set him straight on the COVID stuff.
We can
I
only
think that
hope.
as somebody who pays about as much attention to COVID as Bill Burr and about the same spirit, right? Like I think that would have been, I think my attempt to sort of do some pale shade of that, right? Would have. I don't think that would have been a productive use of anybody's time. I think that in fact, whereas I do think that debating conspiracy theories on COVID is a good thing to do, it's not something that I in particular have done, right? Like in the last 2 years, mostly because I'm just, I mean, I think at some point you got to know your limits. You've got to know what your strengths and weaknesses are. And I think if I'm talking to somebody who compulsively follows the issue, and actually, this is a weird credit where credit's due thing, but this is somebody I hate, but he did make a good point. That Sam Harris has a thing on his podcast where he was talking about why he doesn't argue with Brett Weinstein, why he wouldn't go on Brett Weinstein's show, basically, and Harris makes, I think, all the right points about how, look, like somebody who's just swimming in this stuff, right? They're like they'll come up with like 20 things that are like probably all, he didn't put it quite like this, but it's like probably all bullshit when you really start to look into them like right away. And it's just not, I think there are people who are well equipped to do it, and I think they should do it, and God bless them, right? I don't think in particular, for me, this is going to be useful contributions. That's on COVID, but I do want to talk about what, to my mind, is the core of the issue, which is we're disagreed about, which is the Rogan Kirk comparison.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think somebody like Kirk, I think, a political enemy. I think somebody like Rogan is a guy who's wrong about some stuff, and is also right about some stuff, and is just kind of generally a little all over the place. Now, you said that you first watched me, I think, Michael Brooks. So if you were a regular viewer of TMBS or the Majority Report, you probably know that my view of Rogan is just like, I mean, it's just what Michael's view was. Like that's where I got it, right?
I mean, at the
that
same time, that was a different time where that definitely fit in. Where yes, he had some really disgusting views and everything, but he didn't go to this kind of extreme place that he's been at for the past year and a half. And
I do
unfortunately,
disagree with that, but okay.
rest in power, Michael, of course. Michael wasn't around to experience that.
No, of course, right? I mean, I'm just sort of. I mean, even though I actually do disagree that there's been a change, I actually think that Rogan is in exactly the same place that he was 2 years ago. I have, but I'm bringing that up just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from on this, right? So whether the actual view is correct, I mean, we can certainly have an argument about that, right? But like in terms of what my view is, both sort of analytically about where Rogan's at and strategically about what that means about how the left should interface with him, right? I mean, that's where it comes from, right? Now, it could be that something's happened in the last 2 years should make me question this view. My judgment call has been that this is still pretty much correct. But what as you know, right? If you watched TMBS, the Majority Report back then,
I absolutely did.
that what Michael's view was, and and I think this is reflected in all the segments they did, and this is certainly what he expressed to me in conversation when he kind of originally convinced me that this was the right way to think about it. Is that when you have a immensely likable and popular figure who's a little all over the place, who on different issues and in different sort of moments can be, can kind of be, pushed one direction or another, doing what most left media, does with Rogan, right? Which is to mostly shine the spotlight on him when he's wrong, is exactly the wrong approach. The much more useful thing to do is to, instead of being like, hey, hey world, right? This immensely likable guy with the giant audience. Like he's he's on the other team, right? The more useful thing to do is exactly the opposite, right? Is to play up the good stuff, right? And to play up the views, which are actually more than not, right? That are aligned in our direction, right? So to do things like, the clip of when Rogan does push back against a right wing guest, right? To do those clips, etc. Like I think that's just a approach that makes more sense, and to me, it's an approach that makes more sense to just kind of talk to him, not like I'm debating Charlie Kirk, and like the mission of talking to him is to sort of put a wedge between him and the persuadable people in the audience, but rather to talk to him, again, like you talk to, your mother-in-law who maybe, doesn't wear a mask at the grocery store and has some, dumb impulses on some issues, but, is also like open to certain kinds of left-wing appeals, willing to hear you out. And in other words, rather than sort of seeing like the real, when you're arguing with Charlie Kirk, you're really arguing to his audience, right? Using persuadable people in the audience, using Charlie as a foil, which is, by the way, even then, right? I still didn't do the thing that certain people on the online left would want me to do, because I still think it'd be counterproductive. I'm not gonna, my approach is even there is very, very different from, the sort of waving around the dolphin fetus approach to debating Charlie Kirk, and I kind of think more useful.
And I did think you did really well in that. I didn't have nearly the critique that some people had, because I just held the more realistic approach of like, well, when would you had the chance to do that? How would that have turned out on the set? The sets get weird, becomes a whole thing that logistically.
And again, I think the question to my mind is what's going to move the needle with the persuadable part of the audience. That I think that's the real question, right? What's the thing you could say that's going to like sort of start with something that connects in some way to how they see the world, and try to do something with that, rather than just sort of having the catharsis for your own audience of Lucy, of denouncing it. And and in my view, at least, right, with Rogan. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask and plug in here.
I understand.
In my view, with Rogan, it's a very different context, right? And with somebody like Rogan, right? I see the people in the audience you want to try to appeal to, not as like being like somebody, in the position of like somebody who's like Kirk curious but can be brought around, and who you want to kind of try to immunize them against what Kirk is saying, with some, and the only way that you're going to get them right is by doing that. With Rogan, I would, my working assumption, might be wrong, but my working assumption is that the median persuadable Rogan viewer is going to be somebody who is a lot like Rogan himself, which is, not obviously the sense of being like rich and famous and, blah, 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 right? But like is going to be like Rogan himself in the sense of being somebody who has some left-wing impulses, some right-wing impulses, is probably going to be most open to redistributive economic appeals, is going to maybe be a little turned off by what they see as sort of scolding and denunciation, but might actually be amenable to sort of more direct visceral appeals to compassion, even on stuff like some of the trans issues. And yeah, probably is like is probably also too drawn to conspiracy theories, which is a whole other can of worms.
Mm-hmm.
And so so in that context, right, instead of seeing like Rogan as like Kirk as like the foil that that you're arguing with to appeal to those people, I would see Rogan more as a stand-in for those persuadable members of the audience, right? That I think that the approach that makes sense to me, that feels the most useful to me, is to is to have the conversation with Rogan that you would actually have with a persuadable member of
Mhm.
that audience, which is what I was trying to do. And I mean, and I would say, like, look, the thing that you say about the last 2 years, and what's and what's changed in the last 2 years, and like whether that would mean that this approach might no longer make sense, and I get that. I mean, there's certainly people I respect who have that take. Right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's Sam Cedar's take, for example.
Mhm. Mhm. Definitely
But
is.
since like he seemed to pretty much be on the same page as Michael about this once at that time, and it's not anymore, right? So yeah, I can respect that. I think that I guess what I think about why I disagree, right? Why I think the sort of original Michael analysis still makes sense to me. Um,
Well,
I
Michael was
will own
inconsistent with that too, honestly. Michael
I
was
will
a interesting character. As I mean,
uh,
he would easily go around to saying things like this, and for the most part, yes, he would follow it. But he would easily go after people like Dave Rubin and
well,
Sam
of
Harris
course.
and people like that who,
Well, so do what
sometimes
so do what
yes, they did have
so
okay takes on some things, but and there was this perceived view of someone like Dave Rubin that you could bring his audience around because they were supposedly in the middle and they weren't devoted to either party. And he would still go hard as fuck against Dave Rubin. Um,
Sure. I mean,
yeah.
as have I every time I've ever talked about him. I think that but that's the question, right?
Hmm.
Do you put somebody like Rogan in the same basket as somebody like Rubin? Do you think the approach that makes
Not
sense
with
for
Rubin, definitely not.
do you think the approach that makes sense for one of them makes sense for the other one? We were just talking about that with Rogan versus Kirk, but we could also do Rogan versus Rubin or Rogan
Hmm.
versus Sam Harris or whatnot, right? Like I
Yeah.
think these I mean, I think these kind of have to be taken one at a time.
Well,
So
well
given that,
let me ask you this.
can I just as I say one thing quick, and then we'll
Yeah,
get
yeah,
what you're
because
going to
I'm
ask.
trying to
So
get time in.
no, I understand time is tight. We just say quickly, like I think that so I think that the real question about whether that sort of Michael analysis holds up. And look, I do want to own the part of this that's probably irrational, which I am very aware of, which is that like if Michael Brooks convinced me of something in 2019, I'm not going to say there are no instances that I've changed my mind since then, but that's going to be hard, right?
Hmm.
And I know that might mar some of my judgment, but I do think, right, like trying to be objective about it, that the big reason to think that would be COVID. And I'm pretty sure all of my views on COVID are probably indistinguishable from yours. I mean, I'm I'm triple vaxxed. I'll be quadruple vaxxed as soon as they recommend a second booster. Um, but
Do you still
I
wear your
get,
mask? I'm just kind of curious.
it varies. Like,
I very
like,
much do. BA2 is coming. Just quick
yeah,
aside on
yeah,
that.
yeah. I have. It depends on the context. I've kind of gone back and forth depending on how worried things look at any given moment on like how consistently I do that. But
Especially in Georgia, especially there.
yeah, Atlanta's a little bit different from a lot of Georgia, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's a very blue place
Hmm. It is.
in a sea of other stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that so I certainly agree with you on the issue itself, but I guess to my mind, the real question is like almost put aside Joe Rogan for a second and just like just in terms of the broader world in general, right? How do we approach this, right? Because COVID has become such a culture war dividing line in really frustrating ways, right? That I guess I worry about what the effect is going to be to of sort of writing off like wrongness about COVID as being like as making someone kind of like irretrievably right wing. I think that given the way the culture war has evolved on that, I worry that could be a really self defeating strategy since it's become like just such a dividing line.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, let me. One of the things that you were talking about, with being able to like just sort of kind of let go some of the stuff that you don't feel like you have the expertise in, or you didn't really want to push because it really didn't come up as a topic. One of the things that did come up as a
Mm.
topic, and this is going to be my biggest critique of
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing. So hopefully we have enough time to get through this,
Sure.
because that's most of my notes. The Portland,
Just started here.
Andy No,
Yeah.
and let's start with what you said about the Proud Boys. You said that you don't believe that the Proud Boys. You basically minimized their threat, and you said that they don't have like the power to march on Washington and then try to install their leader. But
Mm-hmm.
the vast number of people who were at January 6th were the Proud Boys. The night before, January 5th, the Proud Boys had like a huge riot go on outside of the White House where they were attacking police officers. Like that stuff did happen, and even if it's not just singularly the Proud Boys, it's the Proud Boys aligning with all these other groups. Like what they do in Portland is they're aligned with Patriot Prayer and the police, and there's a lot of crossover communication between them. There needs to be more investigations of how much the membership crosses over between the Portland police and the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer, because there have been very friendly communications between all of them. Do you really think that fascism is not a threat currently in this country?
Correct. That is my position. I think that I'm all for investigating the police for pretty much any reason, but I think that January 6th, I don't think it undermines my point. I think it makes my point. I think that if you I don't think there was any scenario. I think you could like rewind time and replay that 100 million times, and there is no possible scenario by which the January 6th riot, which was an ugly and disgusting riot, but whereby it posed the tiniest threat to the normal operations of our, you know, halfway democratic, regular institutions
I
in the United
disagree on
States.
that. I,
I
I
would imagine.
yeah, definitely, because I definitely see that more of a beer hall push than anything. Um,
Oh, but wait a
if,
second. The
if it
beer hall
was
push.
was more organized, let's be honest here. If it was more organized and they were able to plan out like when they entered the building at specific times, and they were able to do that, um, like they were seconds away from a number of congressional members with gallows out behind out in front of the state capitol with zip ties to arrest them.
Okay, every part of that I think is wrong. Let's just take it one at a time. I think there's a reason why the beer hall putsch didn't succeed. There's a reason when the Nazis came to power, it was in a radically different way, and the beer hall putsch couldn't have succeeded. So I never quite understand what that analogy is supposed to be about. I think that the gallows that there is that in the protest outside, right? Like not inside, but at the regular legal protest outside. There's a symbolic gallows. Anybody who's ever been to protests in their life knows that. I think the idea that this was like an actual gallows that people were prepared to use is absurd on its face. I think there are.
That's pretty egregious imagery, though. Like if anyone,
Yeah, sure,
if someone
sure,
on the
sure.
left showed up
I
with
mean,
a guillotine, like
but
I wouldn't be for
there
that.
have totally been protests where people on the left have showed up with guillotines. That's
Yeah, and I don't
and
like that imagery.
Okay. I mean,
I think
look,
that makes us
if
look
the
not
question is
serious.
whether you don't like the imagery, you think it's in bad taste, then sure. But
But
I think that's
also,
a very
we're not pushing this idea that we want to install a leader in that way. We don't have a history of violence in the same way the right does. We don't have the bodies that
but they have
the right
but all
does.
of that's just none of this is just at all the same question of whether anybody seriously believes who that the gallows wasn't a symbolic bit of protest theater, the same way that guillotines at left wing protests are a symbolic bit of protest theater. That
But
they
what about
that
the
like
zip ties?
yeah. Oh, let's talk about the zip ties because, as a matter of fact, there's a reason why nobody was charged with intention to kidnap anybody because of the zip tie thing. In fact, the zip tie picture, that was not somebody who showed up with zip ties. That was a bartender who was at the protest with his mom, by the way, who picked up some zip ties that were accidentally dropped by a cop. Right? They have a this is not some sort of kidnapping plot whatsoever. And I think that there is a reason. Let's put it this way, right? There is a reason why nobody who was there made the slightest attempt. I mean, this has got to be the strangest. If you think of this not as a ugly, disgusted riot, but as a serious attempt to overthrow constitutional government, it's very confusing. That there were like zero people who made the slightest attempt to shoot anybody, like a single person at any point in the entire deal. That they have a that what they did is, there were people who fought with cops. That they and I mean, I think, given that they're fighting with cops for a very bad cause, I'm not, I'm less sympathetic to that than just about any other instance of people doing that, right? But also, I don't think we should over dramatize it. And there are people, and people stormed in mostly walked around and chanted and took selfies. Even when one of them was shot, there was no attempt by anybody to fire on the cop who shot them. I think that this is not like, this is a protest against what they falsely believe to be a stolen election that turned into a riot. That is what it was. I don't think that was any sort of attempt at a coup. I don't think there's any scenario where I think if anything had been done to a member of Congress, I think every single one of those people would have died. Is the most likely outcome of that. I certainly don't think that there's any scenario, I
Um, I had
which.
to look in your claim about the zip ties, and
Yep.
I'm seeing one guy who's definitely being charged. He not only had the zip ties, but he was also armed. And one of his buddies testified that he did show up to Jan 6 with them. And he's one of the Texas 3%ers. It says
Okay,
right here.
so I know that the famous picture of the person with zip ties is the person I was describing. Maybe there's
Yeah,
somebody
and that's
else.
this guy. Because
Okay,
they have the picture on this and everything that he showed up, entered the Capitol building. He had zip ties. He had a gun. I mean,
so again, I mean,
Guy
I'm
Reffitt.
looking. I'm looking right now at. Okay, you're looking at Reddit. I'm looking right now at
No,
Insider,
his name. No, not
which
Reddit. His name is Guy Reffitt.
oh, Reffitt.
Reffitt.
Reffitt. Okay,
Yes.
so okay, so I'm looking at an article from Insider, formerly known as Business Insider. Not exactly a Jan 6 sympathetic news outlet. That says the Capitol riot zip tie guy appeared to take the plastic handcuff from Capitol Police, prosecutors say.
Um. Oh, you kind of cut out. Sorry. Uh,
Sorry.
did
So
I
I said
under?
I'm looking at an article.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm looking at an article at Insider. So that's the thing. It used to be called Business Insider. It's definitely a very liberal news outlet. It says the headline is the Capitol riot zip tie guy appeared to take the plastic handcuffs from Capitol Police, prosecutors say.
Is that the same guy though? Is that Guy Reffitt?
I don't know if it's the same guy. This is definitely the iconic picture, right? And he's definitely there with his mobs. This is what I remembered. Let's see if they say his name in here somewhere.
Yeah,
Okay, I
because
think we might be talking about two different guys because the guy.
well, I
So the
mean,
guy I'm talking about is the one who had the. I mean, the guy I'm talking about is definitely the more famous zip tie picture, right? It's the
well,
one where the
yeah,
guy's
the
like,
picture, sure, but I mean, this is still the guy who showed
sure.
up
I'm
in.
just saying. I'm just saying. We could be talking about. In fact, I think we are talking about two different guys.
Yeah, I think so too. But I mean, that still goes to my point that yes, he showed up ready to do these things, and I guarantee he was not the only one. I mean,
Yeah.
like
What do you why do you,
I
why do you
don't
why do you think
take these
he didn't fire the
threats,
gun?
huh?
Do you think he didn't fire the gun?
No, he didn't.
No. I said, why do you think he didn't fire the gun?
Um, well, that gets into a lot of the ideas of hero worship regarding the right wing and policing. I would say that that's it. They didn't look at police as their enemy, so they saw no reason
Okay, so
to
what's the
attack the
plan? I mean,
police.
if I mean, how are you going to do this thing if without shooting cops?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that they thought it outright, but they absolutely see police as their allies, and
No, I mean,
as things
I'm
go
agreeing with
along,
you about that, but I'm questioning in light of that the idea that there's a that
they
there's
think
a
the cops are
serious.
going to join them.
Okay, so okay,
I've heard the right wing talk about stuff like this regarding how they would take over the government. You know, I always tell them, you know, what is your little pea shooter going to do against someone that can drone strike you from 200 miles away? And they'll always say, oh no, the military will join us. The military
okay,
won't do that
so
against the citizenry.
okay, so I think so if the takeaway here is that out of the small minority of people there who are like real like insurrectionary fantasists who if everything had gone just right, would have loved to do these things, right? That there's no serious plan, that the only scenario by which they would actually try would be one that you and I both know would never ever happen, which is that somehow there's in that circumstance in January, January 6, 2021, somehow the Capitol Police or military are all willing to switch sides and side with them. If that's the only scenario in which they would actually draw these guns, then I think we're agreed that there's no possible scenario in which this riot would have actually posed a threat to the normal operations of bourgeois democratic government of the United States.
Uh, I don't know. I really can't agree with that. I think we honestly got lucky on January 6th, and it's going to happen again. They're trying their best to not call too much a negative attention. Though, you know, you look at things like the the what is the Freedom Trucker Convoy in
Mm-hmm.
DC. Like their plan is completely useless and is literally designed, if you look at what they describe it as, to not be inconvenient to anyone. And that's just simply not how protest works.
I mean,
Nor
this sounds like you're agreeing with me here. I mean, like
Yeah.
if that's
Well, I
no,
mean, yeah, no, no.
I
I
mean, if
totally
there
agree
if
with that, but I feel like um with the way that the right is organized, that there could be absolutely something more coming, and this is just one of those things we're just not trying to call too much attention to themselves. Um,
I think the right wing could totally steal elections in the future as they have in the past without anything like this,
Not just
right?
steal
That they have it.
elections.
Okay, so what else?
Well, I mean, they steal election, they steal the Supreme Court. I mean, we can agree that they stole a Supreme Court seat,
I actually
right?
don't agree with that. Although I don't know how productive it is to. Let me just do 30 seconds to say my piece on that. I think that the, I mean, unless you're talking about the Supreme Court seats that were filled by George W. Bush, in which case I agree there's a sense in which those are stolen since the election itself was illegitimate.
I mean, there is
And by
that,
the way,
but like Merrick
but,
Garland, yeah.
okay, yeah, Merrick Garland, I don't think it's correct or useful to say that that was stolen because there's no constitutional or other legal requirement to hold hearings. There's an informal there's an informal traditional norm, but I don't give a shit about that. I mean, if Trump had been um, had been elected in 2016 instead of 2020, and in his last year of office, he had he tried to appoint Amy Coney Barrett back then, and Democrats had grown a spine and said, no, we absolutely refuse to hold hearings. We're gonna do our best to see if we can have, um, we're gonna see, we're gonna do our best to see if we can have, if we can stonewall this. until after the 2020 election, I would have cheered. I would have thought that was fantastic. I don't think that's stealing. I think that's.
I
I mean,
mean,
I don't like.
in that regard,
I don't like the outcome, right? But I don't think
mhm.
there's anything illegitimate about the tactic.
Well, I mean, in that regard, if they were the first ones to do that, honestly, I would probably disagree with it, even if we did get a win.
Really,
Yeah,
why?
just that based on principle. I mean,
It's the principle.
the president has the governmental authority, the constitutional authority to put a Supreme Court justice in that seat. So by
Well,
denying
they have
them,
constitutional
by
authority to
denying
nominate them.
Obama,
There's no constitutional there's no constitutional obligation to hold hearings. It's 100%
well,
up
of
to the
course,
Senate
not
whether or
hold
not to do that.
hearings, but he has a constitutional authority to put somebody in that seat by
Yeah, but
by
the
nominating them through that process.
but sure, but they have the constitutional authority to deny hearings. But what's the problem?
Well, I mean,
Again, I don't like the outcome, but I don't think there's anything. I don't think it's healthy for the
it's using
left.
one part that isn't covered by the Constitution to justify the president not being able to live up to something that is absolutely a constitutional duty.
Well, it's
You know what
not
I
he's
mean?
not able to live up to. I mean, that just I mean, I think that he's not able to succeed. But I mean, there's no constitutional guarantee of being willing
Well,
of being able to succeed. And like I think the larger issue here
succeed is a
is
different story because I totally think Obama could have done a recess appointment and absolutely just pushed him through, which would have been
yeah,
a
well,
move
that's
that
fine.
Republicans did.
I would have been for that too, right? But they
Yeah.
have a but the question I don't think it's helped. I don't like the left sort of make it a like valorizing like it's really important that all of the informal norms and traditions be honored. Like I think that
Oh,
like to even
absolutely not. I think those
to,
are
you know
long and dead, but
okay, well, I mean, to even achieve like minimalistic social democracy, like we'd have to go so much further than that in terms of, you know, disregarding, flouting, and setting on fire, informal norms and
oh yeah,
traditions.
yeah.
I guess I just anyway. So it's a very small thing. It's a little bit of a side point to what you're talking about, but
Mhm.
I don't think it's that always bothered me for exactly that reason. That sort of talking point that the seat was stolen. But look, I mean, could the Republicans do disturbing authoritarian things? Sure, right?
They
Like, but
absolutely did.
would that look like January 6th? 100% not. I think what it would look like is what stuff like that has always looked like. It would look like what Bush v. Gore looked like. It would look like whatever the Patriot Act looked like. It would look like a bunch of guys in suits, who are operating within traditional institutions,
So
doing
summer
their thing.
2021, the unmarked vehicles arresting protesters off the street around the country, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah,
But doesn't
no, I
that
mean,
also then
but
prove that?
that's the point, right? The call is coming from inside the house. I think this kind of focus on this extremely marginal and tiny number of weirdo LARPer, like grassroots fascists, I think is extremely unhelpful. I think, and I think it helps to misidentify where genuine authoritarian threats come from. And I think and I think it takes people's eyes off the prize. I think that I think that, and if anything, right, I think that I'm much more worried about that sort of thing being used as a pretext for further consolidation of the national security state than I am about the thing itself, right? I mean, like, look, I mean, Al Qaeda
I
are
do agree with
fascists.
that.
They have a I mean, it doesn't get it doesn't get more fascistic than what they advocated, and they actually killed thousands of people, as opposed to January 6th, none, since the only person killed on January 6th was shot by the cops. That they actually killed thousands of people, but I also always thought that, I mean, whatever. I remember being accused a lot of minimizing that too, right? But
Mhm.
like, it just seems like how much actual threat is posed by Al Qaeda realistically versus how much actual threat is posed by the national security state. I'd say very similar things about January 6th.
See, I'm actually very surprised by your take on January 6th, just because there's a lot on the left that do minimize it. A lot of the left that you often seek, have criticism from, and you sort of reject, have a similar take to kind of writing off things like January 6th, as
Yeah, I mean,
not
look,
that
that
big of
there
a
are
deal. And
there
I
are
just
people.
wholeheartedly disagree. I like,
I mean,
let me
just
just say this really quick. So,
okay, sure.
back before 2016, I was definitely one of those people who minimized the threat of like racist and white supremacists existing in this country. I knew they existed, and my wife's black. My kid is half black. So
Hmm.
I'm very directly affected by issues like that. But
Sure.
and I was there for Black Lives Matter around that time when it started with Trayvon Martin and otherwise. And
Hmm.
but I would talk to this guy online who was absolutely convinced that the white supremacists had more power and they were going to make a jump around the world to command power, and I completely wrote it off. And then I
Hmm.
would see someone like Trump, and I go, yeah, of course he's going to win the Republican nomination, but he's not going to win the presidency, even though Hillary Clinton is absolute shit. He's not going to
Hmm.
win the presidency. And then he won. And then we see things like Charlottesville. We start to see things like the Christchurch. We start to see like literal fascists take over Hungary. The number of right wing politicians taking over countries like Sweden, and they're I just covered a story where a bunch was leaked out about how authoritarian they were in their COVID policy, to where they wouldn't even allow anyone to criticize the idea that they were pushing for herd immunity. Um, just a number of things like that. And you start to kind of recognize that you need to take this more seriously as more of a threat. Because I thought I saw a massive push towards fascism under the Bush years, and then I see Trump, and it's kitty time in comparison.
Okay, I completely disagree with that comparison. I think that the authoritarian things that happened under Bush were about 100,000 times more damaging than the authoritarian things that happened under Trump. I actually think the
Long
problem
term,
with,
yes.
I mean, even at the time, right? I mean, that they have like, I mean, I think that the holes that were ripped in the the Constitution, by what Bush did, I don't think there's any. I don't think the worst thing that Trump did actually even come close to that. In fact, I think the worst thing that Trump did, objectively, I mean, in terms of domestic policy, in terms of foreign policy, I think he brought us very close to the brink of a war with Iran that could have been, even worse than Iraq if it had happened. But in terms of domestic policy, I actually think the worst thing that Trump did, that was like, and if you want to like actually find something that Trump did that's worse than like what Mitt Romney would have done if he
Hmm.
was elected, because 99% of what Trump did, Romney would have done, McCain would have done.
I
But
mostly agree with that.
if you want to look at the worst thing that Trump did that was like worse than what those guys quite likely would have done, it was his COVID policy, and there the problem was not at all that it was too fascist, and it was almost the opposite, right? I mean, that the problem was that it was way too libertarian and like laissez-faire, right? That they have a that like, in fact, if anything, it would have been a golden opportunity for an authoritarian power grab, which is how you mentioned Viktor Orban in Hungary earlier, which is actually what
Mm.
he did do in response to. I mean, he'd been in power since 2010, but I mean, like he seized a bunch of new powers using the excuse of COVID. It would have been a golden opportunity for that. But the Trump administration response was, if anything, it was grotesque in the opposite direction. It was criminal negligence. The in terms of the the COVID response. So yeah, I think that the
Just
uh,
to
I,
kind of expand on that, though, there was a little bit more to his COVID response than just him basically ignoring it. I mean, there was the fact that he was doing things to undermine specifically blue states, undermining their ability to purchase PPE. He would have the White House undercut a number of distributors, and purchase a bunch that were meant to go to specific states, and would add it to the national stockpile rather than allowing it to be available to the general public. There was a whole thing there that I followed pretty closely. And there is some authoritarianism to pushing the idea that people just need to shut the fuck up, go to work. Your kids need to stay in school. Don't wear a mask. Not allowing kids to wear masks, for one thing. That's still happening now. So
I agree. I agree that there's a sense in which that's all very authoritarian. I mean, I think that's totally fair, but I think that you know in very much the same spirit that I would say, like in general, like if you're like a right wing libertarian, and you want to just let the private employers do whatever the hell they want, that's like very authoritarian in that larger sense. Like I completely agree with that, of course, right? But I think in terms of what people are typically worried about when they're raising fascism concerns, about the that sort of direct state authoritarianism and sort of expansion of the powers of the state. I think that unlike George W. Bush, who considerably expanded that, Trump actually really did not expand that particularly. I think that mostly the way that things, other than the COVID response, which was disgusting, I think that most of what Trump did, I mean, there are exceptions and there are significant exceptions, and I certainly don't want to underplay how much they matter, but I think that like day to day, year to year, right, the vast majority of what Trump did was just that he governed like a regular Republican. And I do want to just highlight here, because you said something interesting a minute ago. I don't want it to get lost, right? That you said you were surprised to hear me take some of these positions because there are people in other parts of the left who I often don't like and really disagree with, who will say similar things, and that's true.
And don't take that as me saying you're inconsistent at all. I'm just surprised in that sort of view.
Sure. I mean, but this is the thing, right? I mean, this is. I think in general there are look, I don't want to do the everybody hates me, so I'm correct thing. I think that would be dumb, right? But I think that
I agree with that.
But I do want to say that I do find it a little bit funny. There are people in very different quarters of the left who have very harsh critiques of me that are exactly the opposite of each other. That they so there are people whose main points of contention are that I don't think the fashion I think that look, I think fascism, and this is the thing I said to Rogan, that he said I don't understand what you mean, and I had to get it back up and say it again, right? At the end, I think that fascism is something that the ruling class turns to when it's worried that that even though fascism is incredibly destabilizing, which it is, that it's worried that the only alternative is just losing everything, like a socialist revolution, right? So I think that given that we live in a country that has like 6.7% private sector unionization, I don't think that's a serious. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that that's a. I think that
but that's not
and I
the
think
only
that
way that it
directs.
happens, too, though. I mean, and not to mention that there's been a mass increase in pushes to unionize places all over the country.
Which I'm very excited about, but let's also put that in perspective. I mean, that they have I think it's potentially the first baby steps in the direction of something really good, right? But I think that they have but like overall, the overall state of the organized working class right now is the worst it's been since like before the Great Depression. Like that like maybe things are finally starting to there's a little bit of movement in the right direction. I certainly celebrate that, right? But but I mean, I think right now I think we are hilariously and tragically far from the ruling class having to worry about losing everything. And I actually do think that's the only way it happens, pretty much. But what I was going to say is, I think so there are people whose big critiques of me are about the fascism issue, or the January 6th take, or I don't know. Let's see, what are some others? Like maybe maybe going on Rogan even, right? That they things like that. And then there are other people whose big critiques of me, big critique of me is that I'm a Democratic Party shill, and
I get that too. Don't worry.
and there are because I thought that you should. I thought and still think, right, in retrospect, right, that it made sense to hold your nose and vote tactically in swing states. I thought and still think that force the vote was dumb, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I would say, look, and I'm not saying that like just the fact that there are people who formed opposite pictures of me based on these different positions means that they're all necessarily wrong, right? Maybe one group is right.
Mhm.
But I guess I would ask whether it's at least some kind of evidence that however misguided I might be, I'm at least making some kind of good faith effort here to call balls and strikes, because trust me, life would be a lot easier for me if I just picked a team and said, like, anytime a controversy comes up, right, I'm always going to agree with I'm always going to agree with this team and intra left controversies. Like I think
Yeah, I'm
every
not even saying you do that. Like, because
no,
I'm
I mean
not that either,
clearly I do that. Clearly I don't do that. I'm just
yeah,
saying that like
and that's
I
fine.
think
That's fine. I think that's
I
entirely fine. And you know,
I mean, because you are ultimately talking about, and I'm not saying there aren't people that I like and people I sort of dislike and people I actively hate, because of course there are in all those categories, right?
mhm.
But ultimately, if we're talking about disagreements that are playing out against a background of agreement about 95% of things to start with, right, and then we're disagreeing about the other five, it does seem pretty natural to me. Like it seems like well within the range of what would be expected that like sometimes you think that some of the people who are starting off from a position of being 95% right are like calling one thing correctly, and sometimes they're calling another thing incorrectly.
I kind of see what a lot of the people on the left uh, do with minimizing January 6th is comparable to minimizing things like the Mueller investigation and otherwise, and what
Mm-hmm.
came out of that. And I disagree with minimizing either of them because I think we can learn a lot from both on the left. You know, we learned a lot about how you know egregious the levers of power can be and how they can still let things go regarding the Mueller investigation. They found an incredible amount of shit and evidence of them destroying evidence, and I think that speaks volumes. Not to mention, you know, what happened with uh, uh, how it was undermined in the first place by Bill Barr declaring this obscure rule that you can't prosecute a sitting president. Knowing something like that really tells you something about the levers of power and what it's willing to do to protect itself. That, oh, all of a sudden, this person who was just the extreme citizen, the executive citizen, the president, is never is far beyond the law to the point where the law does not apply to them at all. I think that is incredibly important to learn. And regarding January 6th, someone in my chat just kind of glanced over, brought it up, like the Ginny Thomas
Mm-hmm.
revelations. That could be the thing that finally takes down Clarence Thomas. Um,
I'm with you on the J.D. Thomas part. Like, I think that so, I mean, I think that that's something where there are conflicts of interest and
mhm,
etc. And that it does seem not necessarily wildly optimistic about the outcome, but I think it's appropriate and worth trying, to uh, to do things like on to resign if he doesn't do it, which he won't,
mhm.
to investigate it and and see what you can make happen there. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, on the Mueller investigation, um, I guess the part of what you say about sort of executive accountability, I certainly agree with you about that, right? I mean, like I think that there's, unfortunately, I think now we have um, I think now we have like several decades of precedent of sort of more and more walls being erected to make it hard to hold the executive branch, guilty of anything, right? Going back to Ford pardoning Nixon, and going, and going up to things like Barack Obama saying when he came to office that he was going to look forward, not backward, and so like ruling out the possibility that anybody in the Bush administration was going to be prosecuted for torture, and et cetera, et cetera. Right?
Something
So
like that can just be just like a personal decision to just decide to move on, and that gets into like how police can pick and choose what laws they actually care about. Like they're not going to pull over everyone who's speeding around them. They're going to pull over someone that they specifically decide that they're going to pull over. Often turns out to be black people, but
yeah.
just
but I mean,
you get what I'm
I
saying.
guess in both of those examples, right? I mean, it's not that like sure, you could do prosecutorial discretion, although I actually think, even within the way that those rules are typically set up, uh, I do wonder if that sort of level of top interference with sort of, what the Justice Department is even going to investigate, right? Like I think might be a little illegitimate in itself, but regardless, right? I think the bigger issue is that what it helps to do is to establish this kind of norm that it's like illegitimate, that like message that Obama is sending when he does this, the message that Ford is sending when he does something again, he has every legal right to do, and pardons Nixon, is the message is that whatever crimes are committed by the executive branch should just kind of be let stand, and if anything, if you try to if you like try to investigate them or hold anybody to account, you're like politicizing it, right? That's the way, unfortunately, over the course of the last several decades, that's widely thought of, right? So like I think so I think that any kind of, I mean, I think it would be amazing if there was anything that you could that you could actually, know, any infraction, large or small, that you could actually hold the president accountable for would definitely be a step in the right direction. I
I
think
agree.
specifically on the Mueller investigation, I would maybe want to separate out the questions of does in Trump or anybody in the sort of like roving band of like minor characters for the early seasons, The Sopranos, that he surrounded himself with, like, did any of them do anything wrong? Right? And I'm sure the answer to that question is like tons of them
Absolutely.
committed,
Yeah.
tons of crimes, right? I mean, related or not, right? I mean, like that, like you just start to look into these people, right? You're going to find, like wild things all over the place. I actually think a lot of them were really scared when he was elected because because they were counting on the fact that he was going to lose, and so various crimes they were already committing, would continue to slip under the radar.
Yeah.
But so that's one question, right? And the Mueller investigation, even though the ultimate report, was came out the way that it did. I mean, along the way, right? I mean, lots of people were prosecuted for lots of things,
Mhm.
that. But
And later pardoned by Trump to cover it all
sure,
up.
yeah, because those are right. Also, those are his buddies, right? I mean, those aren't like some like anonymous QAnon idiot who's arrested at the Capitol who's just going to let rock because he doesn't care about that person, one way or the
Mhm.
other. But I think, but then I guess I would want to maybe separate that a little bit from the question of the sort of core, like, what was the sort of core thing with the Mueller investigation, like about collusion and Russian influence, and what some of the expectations that were set for what that was going to uncover. And on that second question, I was always I mean, like when I kind of came in to started to do this, I sort of came in at the tail end of it, so I didn't do a ton of commentary one way or the other about it. But I have but on that question, I was always a lot more skeptical, and it always kind of felt to me like sort of making everything about Russia was a way of,
Oh, I agree with that. A
anyway, whatever.
distraction. The
Yeah,
distraction is sort of making excuses for the United States populace agreeing with putting Trump in office. That's how I viewed
yeah,
it.
yeah, all of that, right? I would also say, like, look, I mean, if
It's
Russia
not
has
us,
much
it's
influence,
Russia, guys.
yeah, exactly, and I
Yeah.
also think like the idea that Russia has a ton of influence, and like I don't know, like all of the sort of fixation on like the really weird, incompetent Facebook ads and all of that stuff, I think was unhelpful, and like especially like the
Mhm.
proofs in the pudding. Look at what's happening right now. Like that would say, like if the Russians are like master propagandists who have all this amazing influence over American politics, we're sure not seeing that right now because like we have like 74% of the population wants to start World War III by setting up a no-fly zone in Ukraine. By and large, not everybody, right? There are definitely high-profile exceptions, but like by and large, like the predominant Republican response is not really the sort of Tucker Carlson sort of response. It's really like you
It
know,
started to head
I
that way, and then the polling changed, didn't it?
you
And
know,
then
I
now
mean, yeah,
that
most of what I see, like if I turn on Fox News, which I'll sometimes do because I hate myself, or I'll do or I'll just like check out what different Republican politicians are saying. Like by and large, it seems like they've reverted back to like the kind of thing they were saying in 2012. When like Romney was saying in the debate stage that Russia was the biggest threat to the United States, and like by and large, it seems like the main conservative line now is Biden is like being too weak and letting Putin walk all over him and blah blah
Mhm.
blah.
Yeah, the neocon tough man bullshit. Yeah, they
Yeah,
they definitely moved over there pretty quickly once the new polling come out and they seen that no, pushing for a new Cold War is actually a better idea than siding with them. It is
I
interesting
mean, I
that
think
they
I think
would
some of them
though.
are a little bit pulled in both directions because, like, on the one hand, like they they probably still have some bones of Saint Riggin, like off in the back of the church somewhere, like, and they have all sorts of nostalgia for the original Cold War, and they're all hyper nationalist crazy people. But on the other hand, they see somebody who's like a socially conservative, strong man, allied to a bunch of oligarchs in the Russian Orthodox Church, and like I'm sure on some level, there's an instinctive affinity there, right? It seems like they're kind of guy.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I could see that. The original question though, um,
Yeah, yep.
I do. Okay, let me move to this a little bit in regards to the original question around
Mm-hmm.
fascism. Your take on Andy No.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe in? I'm gonna guess that you believe in diversity of tactics because that's what I believe in, right? Like it's like a
Not
general leftist
necessarily.
thing. No.
Not necessarily. No, I think that I'm actually not. I actually don't love that phrase because I think that it tends to, I think that throwing it around tends to be a way of excusing, like, not actually like thinking about like what tactics are productive and what tactics are counterproductive. It's sort of
I
way
don't
saying
think
like,
so at
oh,
all. I don't think
we'll
so at
just we'll,
all. I mean, because
okay.
I think the diversity of tactics argument includes very, very specific tactics that are known to actually work. And to me,
Okay, I think
and I
that's where
don't
the
know if you would
disagreement's
agree.
going to be, but go for it. Yep.
To me, I'm not sure if you would agree with it. And not and full like I'm pacifist. I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
want to be a part of violence, and I prefer nonviolent action. But unfortunately, even if you look at things like the Civil Rights March and any real push for change around the world, violence is a tactic, is it not?
I'm not a pacifist. I do think there are cases where violence is justified, but I also think we need to be I also think we need to be pretty serious about like, okay, what exactly are the circumstances under which it's justified? I think I think you have to be we want people to like spell it out a little bit and to take that question seriously and not just be like, oh, either violence is never justified or it's like fine in like whatever cases.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, I think even as a separate, so Nathan Robinson wrote a really good article right after the No Attack in Current Affairs called Discipline, Strategy, and Morality that I would really recommend people check out. It's like kind of the long form version of what I said to Rogan and like what I'm about to say to you. But like I think even as a separate question from the morality of it, right? There's also this sort of tactical and strategic question, and I think on both levels, I think it's profoundly counterproductive. I think that there's no there's no good, well thought out strategy it could fit into, and I actually also just don't think, as a matter of principle, it's a justified use of violence. I think no sucks and is awful, but I don't think that there's any oral or strategic argument that makes like beating him up makes something that makes sense.
Let me attempt
Okay.
that. So, knowing, let's say you're in a city where routinely there are people coming into your city and attacking people, and they're all a part of the same right-wing militias. They're looking specifically for marginalized people, trans people, gay people, to specifically attack, and specifically people that can be considered on the left, to kind of terrorize and take over the city from the outside. So you start fighting back to defend your community, because you don't want to see anybody hurt, but people need defended, because the cops aren't doing anything. Cops appear to be on the same side as them. The cops also largely live outside of your city's area, and you start finding out that they have like friendly communications with both of those militias. So you start fighting back, and you start noticing that there's somebody who is gaining prominence, who's going around with heavily edited videos, showing specific people who fit a part of this group that is just trying to defend themselves, just trying to defend their community, and plastering their name on the internet, their name, where they live, various things like that. He's stopped doing the where they live, but he'll post their full name and their faces, and then those people that he posts get attacked.
Full David faces of people at like Antifa protests. Okay,
so
keep going.
He may not be specifically like himself harming anybody, but he is acting as a target for those people who want to harm people, to track these people down at their home where they sleep to harm them. And that is actively happening. Do you not consider him in that instance a part of the violence and a threat?
No, and I think it's a horrifying precedent, and I think setting it could only be suicidally disastrous for the left. I have no sympathy whatsoever for this argument. So I think, to start at the beginning, I think the very fact that you're mentioning it in videos, I think already sets off a lot of alarm bells with me. Because if the precedent is you can attack people, you can physically attack people in the streets, you can beat them up for having or being dishonest, for being propagandistic, then I think that I think you've just set a precedent that's going to go to a lot of places that you and I are not going to like. I also don't buy whatsoever. I don't even think it's a slippery slope. I think it's like right there, I think it's like a direct 1-to-1. I think that it's also, I think in general, the idea that, that a sort of turn towards street violence is going to go well for the American left as it exists, is indefensible. I mean, I don't understand how anybody anywhere believes that. And I also think that the idea that if you go to a public protest, they have that you have some sort of right to not have your face or name appear in the newspapers is an idea that has no precedent whatsoever. It has always been understood that that's not the case.
But it's not showing up on newspapers. It's showing up on Twitter from somebody calling themselves a journalist, knowing that he has these personal connections, friendly connections with these people. That is
exactly the distinction that makes me most worried when people try to make it. They have it's like, oh, well, it's one thing to beat up a journalist if they're like a real journalist, but if it's just some asshole, and it's on Twitter or whatever.
But he's not a journalist, though.
Okay. I mean, if journalist means honest journalist or politically unbiased journalist, I agree with that. Although, again, I do not think that is a helpful redefinition or one that would go well for us at all to embrace. I think that, and I think that if you think about where actual freedom of the press issues are going to be fought, in the coming decades, where they've already been fought in the last decade. I think trying to say, well, it's different if you work for newspaper with the word Times in it, and like at a masthead, right? That's one thing, right? But if it's something that's smaller scale and it's online and it's sketchy or whatever, then none of that stuff applies to you. I mean, Jesus, think about stuff like the Julian Assange prosecution, and and people saying that Assange was was more like a terrorist, than a journalist. I mean, think about any number of left wing outlets that that you could describe in pretty much exactly the same way in every way except for the political the political content. I think
there's a difference though there, isn't there? With Assange, he was releasing information, completely without any sort of biased spin on it. He was just releasing this information, saying, hey, read this. This is what's included in this, and handing it over to the public. And I'm also I also disagree that this is going to have the same effect on smaller journalists too, because those same journalists, they're not covering just one side of it. They're going to cover the whole story. What Andy Ngo does is he does absolutely no reporting and will even lie. I know the lie is a part of that. Them being a dishonest journalist, you can still be a journalist, of course, but he specifically works with these groups to hide any sort of threat that they pose to the general public, to the point where the general public believes that the only thing there is terrorist Antifa, without recognizing that the people who are doing anti-fascist action are the citizens of Portland. They are the people there, and the people who are coming in and infiltrating their community is the Proud Boys, is Patriot Prayer.
Don't care. You could be 100% right about all of that. None of that would touch the point about principle or the point about strategy. I think that they have the idea.
But at that point, it's not about principle or strategy or even imagery. It's about defense.
Well, right, but the objection to it is about both principle and strategy, and I'm saying that objection is not touched by anything you're saying, even if everything about it is 100% unambiguously right. I suspect that a lot of it, the more you start looking into it, the messier it gets. But look, I mean, if you don't have to convince me that Andy Ngo sucks, but I think that the idea that like a taboo against beating up journalists in the streets, that it matters or it should matter even a little bit for that taboo, whether somebody's biased or unbiased or has a political agenda or doesn't have a political agenda, or whether they edit honestly or they edit dishonestly. None of that should be even 1% relevant to that. And I guess I just don't understand how that's not obvious.
How exactly do you combat someone like Andy Ngo then?
I think that if your top concern is combating Andy Ngo, I think you have a skewed set of priorities. I think that they have
not top priority, of course, but a priority.
Well, if it's a higher priority than the entirely predictable disastrous consequences of doing something like this, of everybody seeing that you've done something like this, of the precedent that you set doing something like this, of setting down this road, if you think it's a higher priority than that, I think you've got a twisted set of priorities. I think that they have that. I think if you go to a public protest, having your picture and name appear in the media is just well within the range of things that have always been a part of what could happen and what often does happen as a result of that. There's never been a time when that wasn't the case. If you say,
but in media, you have to agree to release your information. You have to agree to say this is my name, unless you're arrested, of course. That's a different deal entirely. But you still have to agree to have your information released. You have to agree to participate. If you choose to participate in an anonymous way, they have to generally abide by that.
Depends. I mean, I think some of the organizations, I mean, if they're worried about being sued, that they might abide by some of that. Although that's certainly not the case that everybody who has their picture. I mean, look, I've had my picture in the paper, after a protest, and without anybody asking me to sign a release, and those were just
but like
those
it's you,
those were like
your
regular
name, quote,
regular newspapers that had
you do this, you work
words like time and journal. Well, I think you're also shifting the goalposts a little bit, right? Because originally it was just picture and name. And now you're
No,
saying,
no, no.
well, it's
I did say references to where they live. That was
okay,
my
but then
initial
you said
point.
it's then you said he'd stop doing that, and then you said but he's still doing picture and name. So what we're talking about is whether just picture and name that they
Yeah.
that is
Well,
such
I
a
apologize because he does also put in references to where they work. Like he'll say where they work at this specific place. You know, it's sort of like the lady on TikTok who does that to people who piss her off. Like she's wrong for doing that. Doxing
okay.
always
Should she be
bad,
beaten up?
huh?
Should she be beaten up?
Well,
Because on
she
Twitter, you know what I do. I
she's
know
not going around.
that 10 million people every single day
She's not
will.
going around into a community and doing this for any specific like political
Yeah,
gain. That's like a different thing entirely.
well,
Um,
but I mean, but I'm just trying to figure out the
that's
principle here
just
because if they
doxing.
have a because okay, so should people who dox should is an appropriate general response to doxing beating people up?
Well, there needs to be more added to it, doesn't there? When it comes to someone like Adding No, who operates as a trigger for a gun of made up of white nationalists and
Yeah,
uh,
I think you've already lost me here. I think that they operates as a trigger. I think that they have a again, if the objection
target. I apologize.
is
He's a
is
target.
is the objection that he's going to dox people that they have a that and that that puts them in danger. The question is that a if somebody is you know not doing anything illegal, they're not actually doing anything that's fundamentally different from what 10 million people a day on Twitter do, right? Which is where they call attention to something that somebody has said and said, Ed Burgess, who works at Morehouse College, how do they feel about this, right? I mean, like that is the bread and butter of Twitter every minute of every day. And you and I both know it, that they have and I think that responding to that stuff by beating people up is an incredibly dangerous escalation. And I think the more you go in the direction of settling this kind of thing with street level violence, I think that even put aside the morality of it, right? And I just don't agree that that's sufficient to justify that. But they even putting aside the morality of it strategically, this seems just catastrophic to me. I cannot imagine any scenario where a widespread turn towards increased political violence was not a disaster for the left.
Hmm. So, do you think? Let me use a different example from a
Yeah.
different person who calls himself a journalist. Uh, that was very similar, but it was all
Mm-hmm.
online.
Mm-hmm.
When Tim Pool released the name of someone he believed to be, I forget which shooting it was, but it turned out that it was another right wing white supremacist. Um, when he released this picture of a black guy and said, "This is the guy that did it. This is his name," and it turned out he wasn't even in the area when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, should should he have been brought up on any sort of charges, or do those charges just not exist?
I think that he probably could have been sued by the person themselves, and I would have cheered them on if they had sued him. I do not think that vigilante violence against him as a result would have been either morally justified or tactically or strategically a good idea.
Hmm. So, if he was on the ground
Yeah.
taking any sort of violence that happened on that level and saying, "This is the person that did it. Um, this is who. This is this is where they work," and that can easily lead you to figure out where they live, because often people work pretty close to where they live, um, and people just start showing up to these people's houses as either a
Mm-hmm.
threat or actively attacking them. Um, how are you supposed to combat that if the law isn't on your side there? If it looks bad, if it looks bad, if it's bad imagery, if it's bad tactically, how do
Mhm.
you cut that off before
I
it
think
becomes
beating him up is
that big a
literally
threat?
worse than doing nothing in
Hmm?
every way. I think, look, if you can't, again, like I think suing people, for example, I think of your Tim Pool example. I think, and I'm not a lawyer, but on the face of it, I think that seems plausible, right? That there would be grounds to do so, and it might be worth pursuing. But I
Because
think
all
that
that has happened.
okay, great. So they have a I think that maybe that'll work and maybe it won't. But I think regardless of whether it works or not, I think um, I think actually doing a vigilante street attack and beating him up is going to be worse on every conceivable level. Tactically, strategically, never mind morally, although I certainly think it's unjustified in principle. That's going to be worse on every level than literally doing nothing.
So just tell them to call the
I mean,
police, even
if
though the
those are the
police
only
don't show up and they've
if
been
those are
proven a
the only
part of that.
options, I literally think that that'll do much more harm to the left than doing nothing. Now, whether those are actually the only two options, we'd have to figure out case by case. I think even if they were, I think that the obvious and predictable harm that's done. I mean, for one thing, I mean, I think Noam Chomsky had a really good statement about this in 2017 when he very correctly said Antifa is a giant gift to the far right and to the security state. But they have a but if yeah, I think that if you're worried about people thinking that Antifa are terrorists or whatever, beating up Andy No is going to do about 10,000 times more to reinforce that than anything that No himself is ever going to say.
Hmm.
They have a so on in terms of if you're worried about public perceptions of Antifa, then that is a giant reason not to do that. If you're worried about increasingly normalizing political violence in ways that could only be a catastrophe for the left, realistically, I mean, given the balance of forces, given everything you were even pointed out earlier, right, about who's who's better armed and et cetera, et cetera, which is the side that in a scenario where there's an increasing turn to political violence, man, I do not want to be on the side with the greater proportion of graduate students in it, than the side with the greater proportion of like veterans and cops in it. They have a, I think that on every single level, principled, strategic, tactical, doing this is a disaster. I don't think there's any defense to it. And just saying that other things aren't working is a terrible reason to do something that's going to make the situation much worse.
So you would have come out against like the Black Panthers or the Stonewall riots.
I don't know where you're getting that. So those are completely unrelated examples that have nothing to do with anything I'm saying.
I mean,
Uh,
it was largely left wing led violence for marginalized communities to push back against the violence perpetuated against them. Am I wrong?
um, well, again, I think even if you're right about that, then I think that that's still a very different thing from vigilante violence against unarmed people and all the consequences that that's likely to have. I think that they have, and in fact, I think if you look at the Panthers, not entirely. There are elements of that history where it does get bound up in corruption and gangsterism. But I mean, I think by and large, the original thing was actually very strict about only using violence in defensive ways. That they even put forced self defense at the end of the name of the party because they wanted to make it really clear they weren't going to go around initiating violence. Right? They were going to be they wanted to make it crystal clear in every way that possibly could that they were only interested in using defensive violence. I'd also think if we're talking about Stonewall, that they have that responding to a police raid, right, with defensive violence is just going to be a very different thing from initiating violence against a physically unimposing, unarmed person because you think the damage they do by the you don't want to use the word journalism, whatever, by the stuff that they write and put out there, right, that they have I think that those are just radically different things. And even though, by the way, I mean, I think if we want to actually have an argument about whether you know about rioting or about armed self-defense groups and whether those whether either of those things are particularly promising strategies, but like we could have that we could have that discussion. But I also think, to give credit where credit's due, I don't think either of those things are remotely comparable to beating up a non-combatant because he reveals too much information in the articles that he writes.
Well, I would expand upon that, but like I'm late to a number of time constraints, and I'm being yelled at. So I would like to continue this conversation another time if that's
Yeah,
at all possible.
sure.
So I think this is an important conversation to have on the left regarding strategy, and you know I do have a very nuanced view of political violence. Like you hear me say all this, you probably think like I'm someone who believes like revolutionary action, like as far as like holding
Mhm.
like a big revolution. Oh, we're going to join. I'm actually against that because the people who are most likely to be harmed in a revolution are the most marginalized, and I am on the side of less people dying than just having some figurative victory that usually ends up in the right wing taking over a country more often than the left wing does. Um,
Mhm.
so I think there's a good discussion to be had there, and I would love to be able to have it with more time, but I do have to get going. I appreciate you coming on. Anything you
Yeah.
want to plug right now, or
Uh, yeah, no, appreciate you, you having me on. I mean, this is definitely, these are all important topics, and I want to, I'd much rather have the 2.5 hour conversation about it than just kind of do it over Twitter. So, yeah, what do I want to plug? I guess I'll just say that the show on Monday night is when Give Them an Argument airs, starting at 8 o'clock, and the one that's coming up on this coming Monday is going to be Rob Larson from Current Affairs, the one of the very few economists who I actually like is going to be on there, and he's going to have a little bit of fun with his libertarian children's book, the Tuttle Twins. So looking forward to that, and the week after, actually, speaking of intra-left controversy, we've got Branko Marketic from Jacobin is going to be on to debate Richard Wolff about vaccine mandates. So I think that one should actually be extremely interesting.
yeah, I would love to see something like that because man, I have a lot to say to Richard Wolff regarding that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well that all sounds excellent, and people should check that out. Give them an argument. The book is your most recent. It's your most recent book, the canceling comedians while the world burns, right?
Not quite, but it's so the
I
most recent
probably
one is
missed
the
one.
Christopher. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, actually, the very most recent book is something else, but that's like an academic book nobody's going to read, so let's not worry about that.
Mm.
The most recent book that's like from Zero Books is the Christopher Hitchens one.
All right. Well, thank you,
Cool.
Ben, and hope to talk to you again. All right.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, it's Mark and Eli. I hope you're doing well. Hope you liked the video. If you liked it, why don't you like, comment, and subscribe? My child may stop picking on me. Uh, uh.